everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have Dr. Onja Razafindratsima here at WashU. Onja is originally from Antananarivo, Madagascar, where she got involved in ecology after a high school club field trip to a national park. She met some field ecologists there and basically said, you can do that for a job? That'd be great. So then she went on to receive her Bachelor's of Science and Master's degree in Animal Biology, Ecology, and Conservation in Madagascar. And it was during her Master's that she became drawn to studying lemurs in particular and was inspired to come to the United States to get her PhD. She got her PhD at Rice University in the lab of Dr. Amy Dunham. During her PhD, she was both an international peace scholar and faculty for the Future Fellow. So after receiving several other awards and completing, defending her PhD in her third language and completing a postdoc in Amy Dunham's lab, she was then a Hurdy Fellow in Conservation Biology at Harvard University. She went on to teach briefly at Charleston College and then South Dakota State before landing her current position as faculty at UC Berkeley in the Department of Integrative Biology. Onja is a National Geographic explorer, a co-founder of a nonprofit, and so much more that I can't possibly fit into this short introduction. So I'll let you hear from the woman and the legend herself. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Onja Razafindratsima.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction and for inviting me to be here today. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about my passion on lemurs and the plants of Madagascar and how they interact and the impact of lemurs on plant movement. And so I've been conducting research in the rainforest of Madagascar for more than a decade with a focus on lemurs and trees. And so much of what I'm going to talk about is about lemurs and trees and their interactions in the rainforest of Madagascar. In case you didn't know, Madagascar is this big island next to the mainland Africa, which about 400 kilometers, I believe. And so I've been working in the rainforest. That's one of the lemur species that I'm going to talk about today, and I'll go more into details about that. One of my interests in studying ecology in general is to understand what mechanisms influence the diversity of rainforest tree communities, and also understanding what role do lemurs play in the ecosystem and what happens if they go extinct. And when we think about tropical forests in general, one of the striking features that comes to mind is that they are highly diverse. And so, like, for example, the case of Madagascar, you might find more than 400 different species in a small plot of a forest. And so, like, this raises the question of, like, what are the mechanisms that shape the assembly and structure of such diversity? And one of the hypotheses that has been put forth is that seed dispersal can influence this plant community structure, because seed dispersal determines the spatial pattern of plants, which may influence their interactions with other plants, either through competition or facilitation, or also like the interactions with natural enemies and abiotic factors. And so all of that would influence community composition and diversity because they're affecting plant survival. And so in that sense, seed dispersal can support this self-sustaining of the diversity of plants in biodiverse forests, like in the tropics. And so understanding this impact of seed dispersal is an important step toward understanding the mechanism that shape and maintain plant diversity in this biodiverse tropical ecosystem. So that has been the focus of my work, looking at how seed dispersal will influence plant community structure. And so seeds can be dispersed by many different number of ways, depending on the plant species. They could be dispersed by the plant itself or by abiotic means like wind and water, or they could be dispersed by animals that are like the animals that are eating the fruits. And my focus has been on the seed dispersal by animals because many plants in many ecosystems depend on animals for seed dispersal. And so this is especially the case in tropical ecosystems where up to 90% of trees are dispersed by animals, including like primates and birds and bats as well. And so this seed dispersal by animal frugivores could help plants in many ways. But most importantly, it influences the dynamics of plant populations. And ultimately, that will help maintain plant diversity and have some cascading impact on ecosystem functioning and maintenance of biodiversity. And also because of this very important role, the loss of key seed dispersers or just their absence from a certain area can have some negative impact on plants and ecosystem health in general. So I've been focusing on the ecology side and the conservation side of seed dispersal by animal frugivores. And I've been conducting most of my research at Ranmafana National Park, which is an evergreen mountain rainforest in the southeastern part of Madagascar. And so much of what I'm going to talk about is going to be about Ranmafana. And I've been also focusing on these three lemur species, Lemur rufifrons, Lemur repreventer, and Pharesia variegata editorum. These are among the largest frugivores in Madagascar, and especially largest frugivores in Ranmafana. And the genera Lemur and Pharesia are actually the largest frugivore, among the largest lemur frugivores in Madagascar. And they can disperse the seeds of the plants that they consume by eating the fruits, like eating the whole fruit and then passing intact seeds through their gut, or they may sometimes be eating just the seed and passing that seed through their gut. So that's how they disperse the seeds. And they are able to disperse the seeds of many plant species with a wide range of size, from the small ones, like the seeds of strawberry guavas, that are very small. I have my hand as a scale. That is a feces from Lemur repreventer with many small seeds of guava. And they can also disperse large seeds like this one over here. Again, my finger as a scale there. This is a very big seed that like you can see the lemur like swallowing the seed and like really hard to swallow and then getting hard to pass through. But because they are the largest frugivores in the system, they are the primary responsible for the dispersal of the large seeded plant species. And some previous studies have shown that the seeds that are defecated by these lemurs had higher germination rates than the seeds that were not defecated, but just manually extracted from the seeds and planted. So basically, they can improve the germination success of the seeds that they disperse. And so this can be the case for like both native and non-native species. And I focus on the seed dispersal by lemurs mostly because the majority of plants in Madagascar have traits adapted for seed dispersal by vertebrates and mostly by lemurs. And so, for example, the case of Ranmafana rainforest, up to 87% of trees and large shrubs are dispersed by vertebrates. And the majority of these are primarily dispersed by lemurs. And the rest may be dispersed by birds or by birds and lemurs. And so the first point I will talk about is how does this lemur-mediated seed dispersal influence tree populations and communities? And one of the main characteristics of seed dispersal by frugivores is that it could be biased towards certain areas because they forage and use the habitat in a very non-random way. So for example, the case of these lemur species, they tend to turn back to their previous location. And even if they start in one place, so like I have a start there, so trees like the orange and trees like the green, they start in one place, they move around, but they tend to always go back to where they were earlier. And so basically they are like repetitively use the same route within their habitat and then frequently reuse certain trees for feeding, for sleeping, or just hanging out. And so by doing that, this very non-random way of like moving in their habitat, they may deposit seeds into these frequently used areas. And so this very non-random dispersal of seeds could be critical for some plant species because they may be able to reach various microhabitats that are suitable for their germination in this way. And it can also like promote species coexistence and this maintenance of plant diversity because it will influence the recruitment of these plants because it will be limiting the frequency and diversity of interactions that the seeds may have with other plants. And for the impact at the population level, we can look at the effect on recruitment. So specifically, how many of the dispersed seeds will survive to become seedlings. And we can look again into like how many of these seedlings will become adult. But so far I've stopped at seedlings because of the time I had to do research for now. But eventually it would be nice to look further away into the adult stage. And so for this part of the impact on populations, we were looking at the seedling recruitment of the seeds of Cryptocarya crassifolia. And this is dispersed by the free lemur species in the rainforest of Orphan. And it's a long-lived canopy tree with large-sized seeds of about 2 centimeters in diameter, as you can see there. And to look at this effect of seed dispersal on recruitment, we parameterized some probability recruitment models. And so we use data from observation of seed dispersal pattern and data on how these patterns influence the sapling recruitment. So for the seed dispersal pattern, we did daily observation of lemur feeding and defecations for 8 groups per lemur species for a year. And then we follow them, see what they eat, where they eat, and what they defecate, where do they do that, and also looking at the microhabitat where the seeds are defecated, looking at the canopy cover specifically and the trees that are around the feeding, the feces with the seeds. And then we conducted an experiment in different microhabitats where the seeds were dispersed to look at the effect of the microhabitat on the seeds. And so it's not just seeds being taken away, but where do they end up and how that affects the seeds. And so as a result of that, we found that the seed dispersal by this lemur species increased seedling recruitment. So the graph that I'm presenting here shows the probability of recruitment per seed that are dispersed by each one of the free lemur species, and compared to the seeds that were not dispersed, but just dropped under the parent tree. Like they just fall under the parent tree, no dispersal. And so as you can see on this graph here, we found an estimated 4-fold higher recruitment probability for seeds that were dispersed by the free lemur species compared to the seeds that were not dispersed. And the main reason for this observation is because these lemurs tend to deposit the seeds in microhabitat that were suitable for the germination of the specific plant species. And so specifically under microhabitat that have more open canopy and away from the parent plants. So I'm going to show you the pattern of the dispersal that these lemurs do. When looking at the pattern of seed dispersal relative to the canopy cover of the microhabitat where the seeds were defecated, so we categorize the canopy cover as gaps when there is like more open canopy of like less than 55% cover, and then medium shaded, and then shaded areas. And then we looked at what exists in their habitat. Do they disperse the seeds in the gaps because that's what exists in their habitat, or because they like to hang out more in the microhabitat? So we found that the seeds were mostly dispersed into gaps and into the less shaded area, and only a few ended up in more shaded area. So the graph here shows the the proportion of the dispersal events that happen into different microhabitat relative to the presence of that microhabitat in the lemur territories. So anything that is positive would mean that they will disperse seeds there more often than you would expect by chance, and negative would be like less than you would expect by chance. So as you can see, the two lemur species disperse seeds in more gaps, which was not the case for Parisia, and all of them disperse more seeds in medium shaded and less into the shaded areas. And another suitable microhabitat would be that they're being dispersed away from the parent tree or conspecifics, because like in the, there might be competitions and interactions with similar enemies around the parent tree, and that may affect the survival of the seeds and the seedlings that ensure that. So the graph I'm showing here shows the proportion of dispersal events by each one of the three lemur species again on the cryptocarrier trees compared with what would be in their habitat if the seeds were non-randomly dispersed. And so as you can see here, only Lemur reference is the only one that disperses a lot of seeds near conspecific trees. But for the other two species, dispersal under conspecific was not different from what would you expect by chance. And these two patterns of seed dispersal were important for this particular plant species because the seedling survival and recruitment were better in areas with low canopies and away from conspecifics. So the graph I'm showing here is based on an experiment in which we planted the seeds in different microhabitat type and also near conspecific tree. And as a result of that, we found that there was higher recruitment in gaps, as shown with the blue lines there, than in any other microhabitat. And even when we were controlling for canopy cover, we also found that the recruitment was lower near conspecific trees versus heterospecific trees. And so the next point is like looking at the impact of seed dispersal at the community level. So one way that seed dispersal by frugivores may impact plants in a community context is by biasing the dispersal near certain adult plant species in the ecosystem, for example, near fruiting trees. And because like, so frugivores, these are highly frugivorous animals, so they tend to spend a large proportion of their time foraging for fruits, hanging around fruiting trees, sleeping around fruiting trees sometimes. And so they may also have a tendency of like defecating while they're foraging or even like between feeding pods. So because of this behavior of like always being near fruiting trees, they may bias seed dispersal near fruiting trees where they recently fed. And so this was the case for many other seed dispersing frugivores. For the case of the free lemur species of the focus here, they also tend to disperse seeds on the fruiting food trees. And so, as you can see on the graph here, the y-axis corresponds to the mean percentage of seed dispersal near fruiting trees compared to random expectation. And so the random expectation was based on the density of trees in their habitat, the density of trees that are fruiting. And so to do that, we collected phenological data on like when the plants are fruiting for like 3,000 trees in their territories. And so as you can see that the free lemur species tend to deposit seeds near these feeding trees upon which they recently fed, more than expected by chance. And this behavior could result in non-random association between dispersed seeds and their adult neighbors. So for example, if these two plant species here are fruiting at the same time, and they have the same lemurs to disperse them, their seeds will be dispersed under each other because the lemur will be feeding on one tree species and then defecating seeds near the other fruiting trees. So the seeds of each species will end up under each one. And so we were looking at how the non-random pattern of seed dispersal that were driven by this attraction of lemur to fruiting trees influence the phylogenetic relatedness between the seeds and the adult neighbor. So basically, we wanted to know if the seeds dispersed by lemurs would land under certain fruiting trees that might be phylogenetically related to them. And the reason we were looking at the pattern of phylogenetic relatedness between the seed and the adult neighbor is because one of the identity of the adult may also influence seedling establishment. And one of the reasons is because of phylogenetic relatedness. The probabilities of seedling establishment may be predicted by the phylogenetic relatedness between the seeds and the adult neighbor, whether the seed was dispersed under a phylogenetically close or a distant relative adult trees, because closely related species tend to have similar traits that are associated with certain biotic and abiotic factors. And so to do that, we measured phylogenetic relatedness in terms of nearest taxa index, which measured the phylogenetic distance between the seed and the adult, and then compare that with a mean phylogenetic distance between random pairs of seed and adults that are randomly selected from a seed pool and an adult pool. So what we found was that there were some fluctuation in months in terms of like where do the seed end up, whether it's below, like next to a closely related adult tree or next to a more distantly adult trees. So the graph here shows the dispersal event per month across time, and then the value of the phylogenetic relatedness index. So positive value would mean that the seed ended up near a closely related adult tree. Negative value means that the seed ended up next to a more distantly related adult tree, and then you have more random for values near zero. So what we found was that in some months, the seeds ended up near the adult tree that were closely related to them. So I've shown it the red at the positive values there. But in other months, the seeds were deposited near distantly related adult trees. But sometimes the seeds will randomly ended up near trees that were neither less or more related to them. So one of the reasons, but we haven't tested this yet, but one of the reasons that this fluctuating pattern may be happening is because of the phylogenetic structure of the co-fruiting plants. It may vary over time. So meaning that in some months, the species that are fruiting at the same time are more closely related than you expect by chance. In other months, the species that are fruiting are more distantly related than you would expect by chance. So if the lemurs are feeding on trees that are more closely related, that's why you may see that pattern of like the seeds being dispersed under more closely related plants. And these seed adult associations could be very critical for the plants because the proximity of the seeds with other plants could influence its interactions with both biotic and abiotic environment, as well as their survival and recruitment success. And this non-random pattern could also mean that the seeds that end up near a closely related adult tree might thrive better because it has similar trait to tolerate the habitat or any abiotic condition that is happening there. But on the other hand, it could also face similar natural enemies as the adult species, so like similar pathogens or like same seed predators. So it may not survive. So this is a future area that I would also like to explore more into looking at the implications. And so as a summary of that first part, we found that lemur foraging behavior can influence the spatial, temporal, and phylogenetic pattern of seed dispersal. And this non-random seed dispersal by these free lemur species also influence the recruitment of Cryptocarya crassifolia in such a way that it was higher for seeds non-randomly dispersed by lemurs than the seeds that were dropped under the parent tree. And finally, we also found that by using this fruit increase at seed dispersal foci, the lemur frugivore structure this early stage interactions between the seed and the adult. And that could result in like biased pattern also in the future structure of the forest and coexistence of the plants. And so basically, this non-random dispersal of seeds by lemur frugivore had some impact on plants at both the population and the community levels. And given this important role, their loss could have some cascading impact on the ecosystem. So the next point I will talk about is the consequence of losing lemur seed dispersers. And so this is a very important topic because about 96% of the 112 different lemur species currently existing are currently threatened to extinction, making them one of the most threatened mammal groups on Earth. And the three species focus of my research are categorized as vulnerable and critically endangered by IUCN. And with some populations decreasing. And because the seed dispersal surface can have critical impact on the demography of the plants that they interact with, as I've shown earlier, losing these lemurs could have also some cascading impact on the ecosystem. So for example, it could affect the ability of the forest to provide some vital goods and services to human societies, such as like carbon storage, as an example. It could also affect the structure and regeneration pattern in the forest. So we set to look at these 2 points as part of like looking at the impact of losing key seed dispersers. And so the first point I will talk about is the impact on the ability of the forest to provide important ecosystem services. So in this case, we were specifically looking at the potential of the forest to store above ground carbon. And so to do that, we did some simulations. We could not remove lemurs from the forest, so we did some simulation where we would simulate the loss of large-sized lemurs by removing the large seeded plant species that are dispersed by lemurs, and then replacing them with whatever plant species are remaining in the community. So we did this removal and replacement at an increasing percentage from 25 to 100%. And then we run this 1,000 times. And each time we calculate a carbon balance between the carbon at the initial community and the final community. So as a result to that, we found that the loss of these individuals of large seeded tree species that are dispersed by lemurs was associated with a decrease in carbon storage. So you can see in the graph with the decreasing pattern there. So as the percentage of the lemur dispersed trees removed and replaced increased, the relative percent of change also increased. And then we were also wondering what happens if we just randomly remove and replace the trees. It has nothing to do with the lemurs, regardless of the size of the seed that are dispersed, regardless of what animals dispersing them. So we randomly removed and replaced the trees without regard to seed size or regard to dispersal mode. And so we found that the forest's capacity for carbon storage remained relatively unchanged. So there was no decrease, regardless of the percentage of individuals removed. And one of the main reasons for this pattern that we observed was because there is a strong relationship between seed size and plant traits that are related to carbon storage, at least for wood density and tree diameter that we use to look at the above ground carbon storage. So as you can see here, seed length was positively associated with wood density and tree diameter, regardless of dispersal mode. So this will suggest that the large seeded trees have high above ground biomass in this specific system. And what's even more interesting is that large seeded species with high wood density and large diameter or lemur dispersed. So with the blue dots there are all the lemur dispersed. And as you can see, with the large seeds and like large diameter, most of them are lemur dispersed with large wood density and large size seeds. And so this pattern of declining carbon storage that we found in Madagascar it's not unique to Madagascar. It is similar to what was also observed in other systems across the tropics. And especially for the ecosystem in Tanzania and Cameroon, we saw very similar pattern as in Madagascar. In this system also, the large seeded trees also tend to have a bigger volume and higher root density than the small seeded trees, and also they tend to be animal dispersed as well. And another potential impact of the absence of certain seed dispersers from an area could be that there would be some changes on the structure and regeneration pattern of the forest. So we were also interested in looking at that. And so we attempted to address this by examining how does the absence of large-bodied frugivores in the forest edge as compared to the forest interior reflect on the pattern of seed dispersal, which would ultimately determine forest structure and regeneration. So this creation of edge as a result of habitat fragmentation can result in changes in both animal and plant communities. And so this may result from like the tolerance of the species to some environmental conditions or some predation pressures or like difference in available resources. And these changes in the floral and faunal communities may affect the dynamics of species interactions by influencing what type of seeds can survive at the edge of the forest in terms of like the size and the species can arrive, not survive. So like they will influence the arrival and assembly of the seeds at the forest edge. And so, for example, the different environmental condition at the edge of the forest may lead to the large-bodied frugivores avoiding this area, which may result in the case that like some large seeded species may not be dispersed into the edge of the forest. And so to address our main goal for this specific project, we first looked at how does edge effect alter the composition of seed disperser assemblages. And then we determined how does this change reflect on the pattern of seed dispersal. So for this, we moved away from Ranmafan and we conducted research in Yufa, as shown with the red dots over there. It's still an evergreen rainforest in the eastern part of Madagascar. It has some soft edges with small expanse of successional field adjacent to like this small scale agricultural field. And it has at least 140 species of trees and large shrubs. And so this was based on a survey that we did in 2017. And also a large proportion of these trees were dispersed by animals. And this was more appropriate for the questions that we were interested on because of the presence of this, because of habitat fragmentation for one thing, and also like the presence of these soft edges around the forest. And so this time, we were not focusing on just seed dispersal by lemurs only, but we also included the seed dispersal by birds to have a bigger picture of the impact of changes in disperser community on the seed dispersal pattern. So we've assigned each bird and lemur species as being frugivorous and also potentially a seed disperser if the species is known to consume fruits or seeds, or if they present also some seed dispersal behavior. So like if you observe them eating fruits and dispersing seeds, or like for some case of birds, we see them taking the fruit with or seed in their beak and then move to disperse the seeds. So in total, we had 11 species of lemurs and 21 species of birds in this community. And so we surveyed the lemur and bird community in the area for a year. And we found that some species were observed in the interior of the forest only. And what's even more interesting is that the large-bodied frugivorous and seed-dispersing lemurs were absent at the forest edge, or they may be less frequent. So for example, the case of Varisia variegata, and these two bird species, Triron australis and Alectronas madagascariensis, they were only found in the forest interior. And some species like the Lemur fulvus were found in both the interior and the edge of the forest, but were less frequent at the edge of the forest. And we also found that the edge habitat was frequented by small-sized species, like the mouse lemurs that are like one of the smallest primates, like you can fit in your hand, and also the Malagasy bulbul here. And so these are very frequent at the edge of the forest. And so to determine the impact of these differences in animal composition on seed dispersal pattern, we collected seed rain using seed traps. So this is how some of our seed traps look like. So we put them out in the forest for a year along a gradient from the forest edge into the interior. And so we would check them once a week to see what seeds are found in there, what has been dispersed, or if the seed was just like dropping from the tree nearby. So we check them every week. And so as a result, we found overall that the seeds that were actively dispersed by animals in the forest edge habitat were smaller in size than the seeds that were dispersed in the forest interior. So as you can see on the graph here, the forest edge received a higher proportion of small seeds that were dispersed than the interior habitat, which had higher proportion of the medium-sized seeds. So this could mean that a small number of frugivores may act as a potential biotic filter acting on the seed size for the arrival of certain plant species to the edge of the forest. And in addition to that, we also found that the forest edge received a lower rate of animal-mediated seed dispersal compared to the interior of the forest. So this could be a result of the fact that most of the highly frugivorous and seed dispersers were less frequent at the edge of the forest. And so this reduced number of the large and highly frugivorous animals in the edge may affect this seed dispersal rate, basically. So as a summary of the main finding about the consequences of the absence of seed disperser, we found some potential changes in the forest potential to store above ground carbon. And we also found that the absence of key seed dispersers could limit the arrival of certain plant species into certain areas, which could ultimately influence the structure of the forest and the regeneration patterns. And so to summarize all the points that I presented today, we can conclude that the foraging behavior of frugivores can influence the spatial, temporal, and phylogenetic pattern of seed dispersal. And this pattern can have some positive impact on plant diversity, plant species coexistence, and also ecosystem functioning. So losing key seed dispersers can have negative impact on plants and the forest ecosystem as a whole at multiple scales. And with that, I would also like to acknowledge that the research that I presented here today is the fruit of multiple collaborations and was not possible without the help of the local Malagasy communities. It's not just me running around 24 different groups of lemurs. I have a big team of Malagasy students and technicians working with me. And here are some pictures of some of my field teams in Madagascar with the local communities who have helped. They've played a pivotal role in determining the seeds, finding where the lemurs are. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, none of these lemurs have any colors or anything for us to find. So my team has been very good at like finding them in the forest or where they are and following them every day. So I'm grateful to them. And some other people and funding who also played key critical role in my success so far that I cannot forget, and I'm very grateful to them as well. And if you're not tired of seeing more lemur pictures, I have more lemur pictures for you here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have time for questions. All right.
Early on in your talk, you mentioned that the germination was much lower if they hadn't gone through the lemur gut, the seeds.
Much higher. If they hadn't, or
Right.
Yeah.
But it wasn't zero.
It wasn't zero.
So I'm trying to be an optimist here, and I'm not really succeeding, but I was thinking that if it's not zero, what it does is it just reduces competition. That doesn't get as to which one hatches and takes over. That doesn't get over the dispersal problem, but I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Okay. Actually, like for some plant species, it has to go through the gut to disperse. For others, they're fine, but the germination is higher when they are passing through the guts. So I think the key part is that they're being dispersed away, and that helps the plants. So it's not just the gut that is helping, but like where do they end up? Yeah. Yes. There is a hand there.
We have some questions from YouTube, very similar to our previous question. How does passage through the lemur digestive tract improve germination? Direct effect on seed, increase nutrients around the seed?
So like the mechanism, I'm not sure what the exact, like, is it because of the feces or because of what's going on in the gut, but it has been like, not just for these three lemur species, but other lemur species too, that like the germination increases more than if you take the seeds and then just plant it. This is something I would like to explore in the future. I want to see what's going on in the gut, but I cannot kill a lemur and see what's going on. Definitely not. But so like some hypotheses that have been like people have been looking also like the effect of the presence of the feces on like as acting as a fertilizer and helping the seed germinate. But it could also be the scarification, because when the seeds pass through the gut, it would be like scarified a little bit, so that would help and like open also like some germination inhibitor helping the seed to germinate.
Great, thanks. I'm wondering, did the lemurs themselves partition the different fruit resources of the different tree species? And if so, how does that influence the dispersal of the fruits?
Like the consumption of like the same species, you mean?
Yeah, I'm wondering, did the different lemur species compete with other lemur species for a given fruit resource? And how does that impact the dispersal dynamic? And
Yeah, some of them overlap a little bit in the home range, and so they might be like eating on the, like they would be eating the same species, but rarely on the same tree. And like they have pretty defined home range in some ways. So like that some of the lemur may be like taking seeds somewhere else, and the Parisia may be taking seeds other places. But there are some overlap in the range too, and I'm guessing, but I'm not 100% sure that that may also like affect the spatial pattern of the seeds in some ways. But that would be something good to look at.
And we have another question from YouTube. Do forest gaps trigger fruiting or cause massed seeding of nearby trees?
Good question that I'm not sure how to answer, but I think it will. I haven't seen any mass fruiting actually in the system I worked at. So I would think that it triggered like germination and helping the plants to grow better. And when I gap, I'm not talking like a huge gap of like open area. It's more of like open canopy in the forest, a little bit of open, yeah.
To talk. In your earlier part of the presentation, you talked about seeming preferences for gap sizes or really coverage, not really gap sizes, but forest cover, which made me think about, you know, they seem to have preference to, I guess, deposit seeds in more open canopy areas, but obviously there's like a upper end to that, like they're not going to go out into totally open areas. I'm curious if like your results have led to precise or good like conservation, reforestation recommendations for like minimum forest cover amounts to like lure lemurs out into areas to be like dispersers of. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes. Yes, but I don't know the answer. I don't think there has been like looking at the canopy opening to lure the lemurs. I know some organizations are like planting lemur food trees to lure them into this regenerating pattern of the forest, so they could bring seeds from the primary forest into the regenerating forest, but not in terms of like looking at the canopy cover. Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff. My question has to do with like the rodents, and do you see any like rodents like taking seeds out of lemur feces and using that as their food source, or do rodents mostly just rely on like the seeds that are directly dropped by the trees?
So I haven't seen them taking seeds from the feces, but I've seen them taking seeds from, I did some experiment of like putting seeds in the forest to see what the rodents taking them, and we've had rodents taking the seeds, but I'm not sure if it's the seed from feces because I've used seeds from just the trees. But yeah, that could be something.
Yeah, this might be another kind of harder to answer question, but just I know quite a few of, especially the larger lemur species, have went extinct or are like at least very endangered. I was just wondering how the like either the extinction of the historical species or the kind of range restrictions of like modern species, if that's like influencing like the plant kind of community dynamics and like the modern forests.
So some plant species become orphans in the sense that they've lost their seed dispersers. One example would be like the baobab trees in Madagascar. They're like very large fruit with like thick husk that the extent dispersers are unable to open to like get to the seed. And so like species like that are orphans. And so like one of my collaborators is actually like trying to see what dispersal mechanism would be like as an alternative to this, the dispersal of baobabs. I think there are about like 500 different plant species in Madagascar that were described as orphans in the term of like either they have this overbuilt fruit that are not being dispersed by like the current dispersers, or the range does not overlap with the range of the disperser. So like one of our projects we're working on is with Canarium, which is LRC, and it has large seeds too. And the range of the Canarium does not always match with the range of the Faricia would be the largest lemur, would be able to disperse their seeds, but the range does not always match. So we were like trying also to figure out what happens to this, what will happen in the future to this plant if they don't get dispersed. And so we're testing a couple of hypotheses with like abiotic factors that may be able to disperse the seeds, or like some of the rodents, because like rodents may be like taking the seeds and like scatter hoarding them. And so like even just one seed being taken far and in a place that can germinate, that would already be very important for the plant.
Great talk. And yeah, I just find interesting that you mentioned like lemurs tend to close gaps, right? But also that they tend to forage the trees they eat. So is there any sort of like relationship with like the vegetation they use and these gaps?
I haven't looked at that, but that's a good point. I don't know. I haven't looked at the relationship between those two.
Well, let's give another huge thank you to Onja and